Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Welcome to the series on history, science, and faith in Islam. In the last session, we covered the historical development of fiqh. This session continues the discussion and focuses on the impact of philosophy on intellectual developments in the world of Islam. As the Muslims captured Syria, Egypt, and North Africa, they became custodians of not just the people of those countries, but their ideas as well. Most of those lands had been under Eastern Roman or Byzantine control, where Greek thought was dominant. Historically, the term Greek thought is applied to the collective wisdom and classical thinking of the people of Eastern Mediterranean, which includes a broad geographical arc extending from Athens in Greece through Anatolia, Syria, Egypt, and Libya. Greek civilization extolled the nobility of man and placed human reason at the apex of creation. Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, and Archimedes are some of the household names from the galaxy of thinkers produced by this civilization. The enduring achievement of Greek thought is that it perfected the rational process and left its lasting legacy for humankind. The Muslims were the first inheritors of Greek thought. It was through the Muslims, more specifically the Spanish Muslims, that rational thought reached the Latin West. And it was only after the 12th century that the West woke up from its slumber and adopted the Greek civilization as its own, while about the same time Muslims turned away from rational thought towards more esoteric and intuitive thinking. The early Muslims not only adopted the rational approach, but set out with enthusiasm to explain their own beliefs in rational terms. Questions relating to the nature of man, his relationship to creation, his obligations and responsibilities, as well as the nature of divine attributes, were tackled. No Muslim scholar would embark on an intellectual effort unless his approach had a basis in the Qur'an. The rationalists saw a justification for their approach in Quranic verses. For instance, behold, in the creation of the heavens and the earth, there are indeed signs for a people who are wise. And in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Indeed, the Quran invites human reason to witness the majesty of creation and reflect on its meaning and understand the transcendence that suffuses it. The philosophical sciences that evolved as a result of this effort are referred to as kalam, which means discourse, usually a religious discourse. Sometimes kalam is vaguely translated as theology, but theology as a science never caught on in Islamic learning as it did in Christianity, because the Muslims strove and succeeded in preserving the transcendence of God. Christianity adopted the position that God is knowable in person and is hence accessible to human perception. The Muslims despite the philosophical challenges of the Greeks, succeeded in maintaining the position that God is knowable by his names, attributes, and through the majesty of his creation, whereas his transcendence is hidden by his light. The first Islamic scholar who tackled the questions of Islamic belief from a rational perspective was Al-Juhani, who passed away in the year 699 CE. Observe that the rational approach places human reason at the apex of creation and makes the world knowable. Al-Juhani maintained that men and women not only have the capacity to know creation through their reason, but also have the capacity to act as free agents. Belief is the result of knowledge and understanding. Indeed, humankind has the moral imperative to understand God's creation. Man, as a rational being, is mandated not only to understand the world, but also to act on it using his free will. Thus, Al-Juhani's views bestowed upon humankind reason and responsibility. Heaven and hell were consequences of human action. This school of philosophy was known as the Qadariya school. The Qadariya school of philosophy is not to be confused with the Qadariya Sufi brotherhood, named after Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani of Baghdad in the 12th century. The Qadariya approach, when pushed to the limit, takes God out of the picture of human affairs, in as much as it makes heaven and hell mechanistic and solely predicated upon human action. This was unacceptable to the Muslim mind. Reaction from the more orthodox quarters was bound to surface, and this happened with the emergence of the Khida, meaning predestination school. The founder of the school was Ibn Safwan, who died in the year 745. According to Ibn Safwan, all power belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and man is predetermined in his actions, good or evil, as well as his destination towards heaven or hell. Like the Qadariya school, the Khida school sought its justification in the Qur'an. For instance, the ayah, "Say, I have no power over any good or harm to myself except as Allah wills." And in the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Wasil ibn Atta, who passed away in the year 749 CE, combined, developed, and articulated the Qadariya school into a coherent philosophy, which came to be known as the Mu'tazilite school. We may also look upon the Mu'tazila school as the first response of Islamic civilization to the challenge of Greek rational thought. The principles of the Mu'tazila school were the following. 1. The uniqueness of God or Tawheed. 2. The free will of man. 3. The principle of human responsibility and of reward and punishment as a consequence of human action. 4. The moral imperative to enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong. The Mu'tazilites applied these principles to the issues of relationships of man to man, of man to the created world, and of man to God. By placing man at the center of creation, they sought to make him the architect of his own fortunes and emphasized his moral imperative to fashion the world in the image of God's commands. Khalifa Mamun adopted the Mu'tazilite school as the official dogma of the empire. From Khalifa Mansur to Khalifa Al Mutawakkil, that is between the years 747 to 845 CE, the Mu'tazila school enjoyed official patronage. It was during this period that a Darul Hikmah was established in Baghdad, and books of Greek philosophy, Hindu astronomy, and Chinese technology were translated into Arabic. Learning flourished, and Baghdad became the intellectual capital of the world. The undoing of the Mu'tazilites was their excessive zeal and their inability to comprehend the limitations of the methodology they championed. With official sanction, they punished those ulama who disagreed with them and tried to silence all opposition. They also overextended their deductive methodology to attributes of God and of the Qur'an. In Islam, God is unique, and there is none like unto him. Therefore, the Mu'tazilites argued, the Qur'an cannot both be part of him and apart from him. To preserve the uniqueness of God, that is Tawheed, they placed the Qur'an in the created space. In other words, they said that God created the Qur'an at a certain point in time. The issue of created caused a great deal of division and confusion amongst Muslims. Furthermore, by maintaining that reward and punishment flowed mechanistically from human action, they left their flank exposed for an intellectual attack. If humans are automatically rewarded for the good deeds and automatically punished for the evil, then where is the need for divine grace? The deterministic approach was repugnant to Muslims, and a revolt was inevitable. The challenge to the Mu'tazilites came from the Usuli, meaning based on principle, ulama, the best known among whom was Imam Hanbal, who passed away in the year 855 of the Common Era. A great scholar, he learned the principles of fiqh from all the schools prevalent in his generation, namely Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Jafariya, as well as the Kalam schools of the era. Mu'tazilite ideas were causing a great deal of confusion amongst the masses. Stability was required, and innovation had to be combated. Imam Hanbal argued for strict adherence to the Qur'an and the verified Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Any principle, legal or philosophical, not based on the Qur'an and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ was to be considered bid'ah, meaning innovation. Imam Hanbal took issue with the principle of ijma unless it was sanctioned by the Sunnah, and totally rejected istihsan and qiyas as methodologies for fiqh. His position was a direct challenge to the Mu'tazilites, who enjoyed official patronage from the Khalifas. Consequently, Imam Hanbal was punished and jailed for most of his life. His sustained and determined opposition galvanized those who fought the Mu'tazilites. Imam Hanbal was joined in his fight against the Mu'tazilites by the inductive as opposed to deductive philosophers. The inductive philosophers derived their inspiration from those ayahs in the Qur'an that call upon man to use both his senses and his reasoning to witness the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, the Quranic approach is both empirical and rational, as opposed to the purely speculative reasoning championed by the Mu'tazilites. The Mu'tazilites neglected the empirical, and in their dependence solely on the rational method, they were incapable of defending themselves from the other schools. The struggle of Imam Hanbal bore fruit, and Caliph Al Mu'tadid abandoned the Mu'tazilite school in 847 of the Common Era. In turn, when the Asharites gained the upper hand, the Mu'tazilites were punished, jailed, and silenced. Such is the fate that differing ideas have suffered at times in Islamic history. The Hanbali school flourished in Arabia and Western Iraq until the Wahhabi movement in the 18th and 19th centuries co-opted it. Because the Wahhabi school was considered disruptive of accepted practices, it came into conflict with the Ottomans in the 18th century. The Ottomans accepted tasawwuf as a legitimate mode of knowing, and since they were Hanafis, were much more liberal in their interpretations. After the Wahhabis captured the Hijaz from the Ottomans in 1917, the Hanbali fiqh became the official jurisprudence in Arabia, later known as Saudi Arabia. As practiced in Arabia, the Hanbali fiqh is known for its abhorrence, indeed condemnation, of anything that is bid'ah, meaning innovation, a practice not in strict accordance with the Qur'an and the verified Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. The four schools of Sunnah fiqh, namely Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali, are mutually recognized. And there have been moves in recent years to bring the Ithna Ashari and Zaidi fiqhs also under the mutual recognition umbrella. Historically, however, there have been occasions when frictions between them played an important part in the outcome of historical events. Specifically, just before the invasions of Genghis Khan in 1219, one reads of overt hostility between the followers of the Hanafi, Shafi'i, and Ja'fariya fiqh in Khorasan and Persia, a situation that played to the advantage of Genghis Khan in his war against the Shah of Khwarazm. The school of thought that had perhaps the most pervasive impact on Islamic thinking was the Asharite. Indeed, one may take the position that the Asharite ideas have been a primary driver of Islamic civilization since the 3rd century after the Hijrah. The vast majority of Muslims through the centuries have followed one of the 5 schools of fiqh: Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, Hanbali, Ja'fariya, plus the Asharite philosophy. The difference is that the five schools of fiqh are overtly discussed and have been the source of cooperation and friction, whereas the Asharite ideas have been absorbed into Islamic culture like water in an oasis. The direction, achievements, and failures of Islamic civilization have been influenced in no small measure by Asharite thinking. From Al-Ghazali of Baghdad, who passed away in the year 1111 CE, to Muhammad Iqbal of Pakistan, who passed away in 1938 CE, Asharite ideas have burst out on the Islamic landscape like an ebullient fountain and have influenced the direction of collective Muslim struggles. Named after its architect, Al-Ashari, who passed away in the year 935, it was the Asharite school that finally defeated the Mu'tazilites. Al-Ashari was initially a Mu'tazilite. The Mu'tazilite school had placed reason above revelation and had come to the erroneous conclusion that the Qur'an was created in time. Such views were repugnant to Muslims. Al-Ashari turned the argument around and placed revelation ahead of reason. The crux of the Asharite argument lies in the definition of the phenomena of time. Al-Ashari was well aware of the Greek view that matter may be divided into atoms. He extended this argument in time and postulated that time moves in discrete steps. At each discrete step and at all times in between, the power and grace of God intervenes to determine the outcome of events. This conceptual breakthrough enabled the Asharites to preserve the omnipotence of God, whereas the Mu'tazilites had failed on this score precisely because they assumed, much as Newtonian mechanics does today, that time is continuous, so that a given action automatically and mechanistically leads to a reaction. If the outcome of an event is completely determined by the action that causes it, then there is no room for the intervention of God and the world becomes secular. This is precisely what happened to the Western and now global civilization 1,000 years later. We may summarize the Asharite pyramid of knowledge as follows. Atoms and the physical world are at the lowest rung of the ladder. The physical world is subject to reason, but reason itself is subject to and superseded by revelation. By contrast, the model presented by the Mu'tazilites, as well as the Greeks and the modern secular civilization, places both the physical world and revelation subject to understanding by reason. Two other important elements of the Asharite philosophy need to be stated. The Asharites asserted that only God is the owner of all action. Man had no independent capacity to act, but is merely an agent who has acquired this capacity as a gift from God. This doctrine, known as the doctrine of Qasab, was misunderstood and misinterpreted by later generations of Muslims as predestination. Indeed, some Muslims raise predestination to be the sixth pillar of Islam. One may put forward the argument that it was a contributing factor in the stagnation that was to envelop the Muslim world in later centuries. Second, the Ash'arites held that there is a divine pattern to nature, but no causality. The cause and effect that we perceive is only apparent and is only a reflection of the attributes that are inherent in nature. This doctrine was a central argument in Al-Ghazali's famous treatise, Tahaffuz al-Falasifa, which means the repudiation of the philosophers, published circa 1100 CE, that provided the death knell for philosophy in Islam and fundamentally changed the course of Islamic history. Ibn Rushd, who passed away in 1198 CE, perhaps the greatest philosopher the world has produced since Aristotle, provided a counter-argument to this doctrine in his famous treatise, Tahaffuz al-Tahaffuz, Repudiation of Repudiation, circa 1190 CE. The Muslims adopted Al-Ghazali, whereas the West adopted Ibn Rushd, and the two civilizations went in different directions. The consequences for the unfolding of global history were enormous. The appearance and development of the Mu'tazilite and Ash'arite doctrines more than 1,000 years ago is essential to an understanding of Islamic history and of contemporary Muslims. The Mu'tazilites stood on the shoulders of the Greeks, but made the error of applying their methods to the Qur'an and forcing their views on fellow Muslims. For this error, their ideas were banished from Islam into the Latin West. The Ash'arites stood on the shoulders of the Mu'tazilites, but repudiated their methods and called them kafirs. Later generation of Muslims misunderstood the Ash'arites, confused their doctrines with predestination, and went to sleep. It is only in the last 100 years that Muslim thinkers, such as Muhammad Iqbal of Lahore, have made an attempt to reconcile the doctrines of predestination and free will of man. Summarily, the Mu'tazilite school flourished for almost 200 years and at times was the dominant school of thought among Muslims. Its influence was comparable to the schools of Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, or Imam Malik. The Mu'tazila school was challenged by Imam Hanbal and Hasan al-Ash'ari, and was finally vanquished by Imam al-Ghazali. This battle of ideas had a profound impact on Islamic history. It influences Muslim thinking even to this day. This concludes our session on the impact of philosophy on intellectual developments in the world of Islam. In the next session, inshallah, we'll focus on the development of Ja'fariya fiqh and other developments. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.